Mr Windeyer, may I ask you please, what cash flow losses did NBN Co incur in the financial year of 2020?
Senator, again, I might see if Ms Brown has that detail to hand. We can certainly find the detail from NBN's published information.
Unfortunately, I don't have it at hand. I would need to find it in the annual report or in the most recent half-year results.
But in previous years, this information was published in the corporate plan. I would have been able to find it easily, but it wasn't in the most recent 2021 corporate plan. Is that correct? Certainly,
there were the most recent corporate plan had slightly different information published in it than previous corporate plans. That's true, Senator.
But I note in 2021, the corporate plan was delayed. Is that correct? It didn't come out at the same time. It was released after Minister Fletcher's press club speech, where the government at that time unceremoniously announced it was backflipping from copper to fibre. Mr Windeyer, is this information about cash flow losses incurred over 2020 contained in the annual report?
We have now found the statement of cash flows in NBN's annual report. It can be found on page 129 of the annual report, and it shows the figures for the financial year to 30 June 2019 and financial year 30 June 2020.
Thank you, that's helpful. Mr Windeyer, on page 48 of the 2020 NBN corporate plan, have you got that before you?
I don't have it in front of me, Senator.
There's a copy of it here. Page 48. This corporate plan forecast NBN Co would run a $6.1 billion cash flow loss for the financial year of 2020. Can I ask, please, what cash flow loss NBN Co did actually run?
Sorry, isn't that the figure that Ms Brown just gave, the cash flow outcome?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, what year was it, Senator, you were interested?
So the cash flow loss was some 7.4. Could you give me the figure again? It was 7 something.
The cash flow statement shows net cash used in investing activities, which I don't think is a number you were looking for.
No, it's a loss figure. So in the corporate plan of 2020, it had a forecast of $6.1 billion, and I'm asking what the actual loss was. Which is the previous figure, indeed the previous figure that I had asked for. On page 45 of the 2019 NBN annual report, and I've got that here as well, page 45 of that says, net cash flows provided by financing activities reflect the drawdown of debt to fund capital expenditure and subscriber costs of approximately $7.5 billion, offset by interest payments on borrowing $352 million and payments for finance leases, primarily relating to right of use arrangements over infrastructure provided by Telstra, $385 million. So that paragraph indicates that NBN Co ran a $7.5 billion loss in financial year 2019, and that matches the figures on page 48 of the corporate plan that report actual for the same period. Am I correct in saying that?
Senator, could I just clarify? You're talking about a negative cash flow outcome for the year.
I beg your pardon?
You're talking about cash flow, including cash from investing activities that create assets. Is that correct?
I'm talking about the figure, how the figure is derived in your in NBN Co's
but you're talking about a
corporate plan.
Cash flow rather than operating.
Yeah,
Yep, okay.
that's right. Not the income. Financing activities reflect the drawdown of debt offset by interest on borrowings, finance leases payments, etc.
Senator, I can see the numbers you're referring to, and I would wish to just take on, double check, and very happy to come back later in the day and confirm that we're definitely comparing apples with apples in that instance. But I think, but on a quick glance at the various documents, I think you're correct. Yeah.
Thank you, and I can see that you know that I'm correct. Well, that you would have confidence in that because you're clearly reasonably aware, because you understand that the fundamentals changed within the corporate plan. On page 59 of the NBN annual report, the correspondence paragraph to the one I referenced from 2019, if you're able to correspond from the 2019 corporate plan to the 2020 annual report, that report said net cash flows provided by financing activities reflect the drawdown of debt of $7.4 billion, offset by interest charges on borrowings $649 million, and finance lease payments relating to the right of use of $800 million. But in the annual report for 2020, it has no corresponding reference in the 2021 corporate plan. Information about those same cash flows were omitted from the corporate plan. And I would argue that information was omitted for political purposes because it relates right back to the backflip that the government did regarding copper. But anyway, I need to take you through this. Mr. Windier, can you confirm that this paragraph, 2020 in the annual report, indicates that in the financial year 2020, the same period for which 78 million in corporate bonuses were paid out, NBN Co ran a $7.4 billion cash flow loss for the financial year of 2020?
Senator, I can confirm that what you're saying is, based on what NBN has disclosed in their 2020 annual report around net cash flows provided by financing activities reflect the drawdown of debt.
Just an accounting point here. So the 7.4 represents drawdown of debt for investment purposes. So when we talk about losses, it's usually about operating losses, using the operating statement rather than the statement of cash flows, because cash used for investment in an asset, we don't usually count as a loss. So we talk about a negative cash flow.
No, I understand the point you're making, but these are the very same set of figures from the previous financial year that I'm chasing it, and that's how it's characterised. Cash flow, and for financial year actual, cash flow $7.5 billion.
Certainly negative
loss.
cash flow of 7.5.
Yes, thank you. Why was information about this cash flow loss omitted from the 2021 NBN corporate plan?
Senator, I'll make some remarks and then Ms Brown might have further to add, but there were a number of changes that NBN chose to make in its in its corporate plan, driven in large part by the fact that the company has reached a different stage in its operation and has a different relationship with, and it has a sort of more complicated arrangement now that it is operating to raise a whole lot of debt from private debt markets. The move from the major build phase of the project to now a more a different phase where the company is operating with a built network and making prudent decisions for further upgrades and investment as and when the business case makes sense, suggests there was a need to change or alter the nature of the things that were reported in the corporate plan.
That doesn't seem very clear. So, okay, if you want to drill down, what justification is there for hiding in that corporate plan the nature of that $7.4 billion cash flow loss?
Senator, I don't think there are a range of documents that go to transparency and information provided to the company. I don't think it's accurate to characterise it as an attempt to hide. As you've pointed out, there's information disclosed in annual reports as well as in corporate plans. And as I said previously, there were reasons associated, the two primary reasons being the fact that the company is now in the process of looking to raise debt, as well as the fact that the company has now changed its arrived at a different point in time where it is no longer in the primary build phase into a run phase that caused changes in the way the corporate plan should be. So the fact that the corporate plan's release date was delayed by 3 weeks, released in the afternoon following the government's unceremonious copper backflip was announced at the National Press Club, has nothing to do with it. Is that what you're trying to tell me? Senator, that is correct. The reason the corporate plan was delayed was there were a number of factors, but the primary one in the context of COVID, there was a general position or change to requirements established by the Minister for Finance with respect to the timing of corporate plans, and in fact all entities, I think, were the requirement to publish corporate plans at the end of August was changed and extended through till the end of January 2021. So there were a number of corporate plans that would not have been published at the original time. NBN was published it as quickly as it could, but it certainly did need to take into account and make sure it had included in it the things that were announced by the Minister. See, the problem for me and for others trying to keep up on these issues, and I can highlight this by going to page 48 of the NBN corporate plan of 2020, that forecast a cash flow loss of $6.1 billion, but according to the annual report, they ran a loss of $7.4 billion. Is that correct? So, Senator, I'll come back to the point I made earlier. I would like to... I understand the figures you are referring to. I would like to just confirm that we are comparing like with like in that context, picking up the point that Mr Atkinson made earlier. We just need to... I just want to assure myself that we're comparing two numbers which are like with like. Well, I note that we are, unless, of course, the fundamentals in how those figures are derived have changed. But the information that would have ordinarily been made visible in the corporate plan was omitted in the 2020 corporate plan. And let's be clear, NBN Co ran in 2020, that financial year, a $1.3 billion cash flow loss, more than was forecast for the previous year. That's correct, isn't it?
So did you say 1.3 or 7?
1.3. 7.4 billion minus 6.1 billion, which the forecast was out by 1.3 billion.
Yeah.
Senator, I'm making reference to resource management guides that Department of Finance puts out in relation to the content of corporate plans. You may be interested in reading Resource Management Guide number 126 and Resource Management Guide number 133. Mm-hmm. That outlines what Commonwealth entities and Commonwealth companies need to include in their corporate plan.
So the Department of Finance wasn't interested in transparency about these losses either. I would have thought the transparency around these losses is actually important. Why is the Department of Finance now guiding for these things to be hidden away as well?
So these resource guides provide guidance to entities in writing their corporate plan, and there is a table in there that indicates the type of information to be included in a corporate plan. It does not indicate that cash flow forecasts must be included in corporate plans. What it does require is that corporate plan sets out that information that will enable a reader to understand the activities of the company going forward for the next 4-year period. The focus of NBN, as Mr Windier said earlier, changed from being a focus on the build of NBN to one of being an operational company, which changed the nature of the information that needed to be disclosed in a corporate plan to outline what were the activities of NBN going forward.
So Senator Pratt, I could continue for a bit, but I do have other questions when you are ready to take
Thank you. I've got 5 or 6 more questions. The point they omitted, you have omitted cash flow forecast for this plan. Is it
Senator,
not
it was
relevant that, to my mind, the previous year's corporate plan put in a forecast cash flow blowout in terms of it forecast some $6 billion in the red. The actual was 7.5, and yet the following year, that very same figure is entirely omitted. It seems fairly obvious to me that there would be a political motivation in wanting to hide a future cash flow blowout of some $7.5 billion, particularly in the context of the policy backflip that the government did at the time.
Senator, I don't think we would, for a start, the decisions, the corporate plan is a document which is prepared by NBN Co in accordance with and needing to meet the requirements that Ms Brown read out, which are set for all government business enterprises. Okay. And they all will publish, depending on their circumstances, slightly different things, or provide slightly different things in their corporate plan, and that in turn will mean all GBEs provide slightly different things in the public domain.
Okay.
In terms of the point about transparency, I think it is important to note that there are a number of points of transparency, and you have included, as you're drawing attention to, there is a disclosure. There was a disclosure of a forecast and then a disclosure of a number in an annual report.
Okay, but in this context, as far as, and this goes to the type of investment that specifically we're talking about, you're saying that if they've got a right to change it, it's appropriate to change it because they're in the new phase of NBN Co. But in the context of the fact that the government made a backflip in relation to copper and fibre, the cost increase in that regard occurred before the backflip decision was made and pertained to the original rollout, didn't it?
Well, Senator, I think we've got a corporate plan. You're referring to a forecast figure in a corporate plan.
The corporate plan, in effect, changes midstream by this government. It's not a new phase necessarily if you're changing your whole mode of technology
Senator, within it. I think we would absolutely characterise the decisions that were taken and announced represented a the next phase of investment cycle for the company in in an operational phase rather than in a continuation of the project build phase. And it is certainly true that decisions that are made after the publication of a corporate plan obviously won't be reflected in that corporate plan and may well be picked up in either annual reports or subsequent corporate plans.
That's right. So the evidence indicates the initial NBN rollout had gone over its revised $51 billion budget. However, that is not visible in the 2021 corporate plan at the same time as, there's a significant technology change. That indicates to me that the corporate, you argue it's just the corporate plan moving on to a new phase, but actually it covers up and hides a whole lot of fundamentals about the corporate strategy and the costs associated with it.
Senator, I don't think the corporate plan, it's certainly not designed to do what you are suggesting, and in terms of transparency of information associated with what NBN has done to date, that is where they obviously report considerable amounts of information in the context of their annual report.
Okay, but how is the public supposed to know that the NBN rollout had gone way over its revised $51 billion budget? This information was available to the department and NBN Co, and yet it did not appear in the corporate plan, and conveniently it enabled the government to point illegitimately in the wrong direction, saying there's no cost blowout here. It is a sushi train of cost blowouts, and this documentation absolutely covers that up. And yet you're saying that there's some arcane information from finance that indicates how they're supposed to report these things. What is the purpose of a corporate plan if not to understand these fundamentals?
I suppose the corporate plan is a forward-looking document. It's about the activities of NBN going forward for the next 4 years. The annual report is what provides the historical information, and then the accumulation of all of that information probably provides the broader overview which you're looking at. It's all made public, it just needs to be...
So it's quite convenient then that finance changed its reporting parameters to suit NBN Co not having to disclose this
just
in
correct, finance didn't change the reporting. I was referring to resource management guides that have probably been out for a number of years, and it's general guidance to Commonwealth entities as to how to do corporate plans.
Okay, so was NBN Co obliged to, if they'd been out for a number of years, why did it change this year rather than in previous years?
For the reasons we articulated earlier, Senator, because the company had got to a different phase in its operations.
A different phase in its operations, nothing to do with the fact that it didn't want to highlight this massive cost blowout.
Senator, the changes to what NBN publishes in its corporate plan are done to be consistent with the requirements and relevant to and appropriate for the nature of the organisation at that point in time. And we are entering a phase where
so why was it appropriate in this particular point in time to cover up the cost blowout in its cash flow when that had been reported the previous year in the previous corporate plan, albeit it had been underestimated? It would have had to report in the new corporate plan to be consistent with the old corporate plan, and the actual cost blowout of 7.5 when it had been forecast as 6.
Senator, I think I just can't accept the characterisation. The publication of the numbers, as you've pointed out, is there in the annual report to see what the actual costs were, and it's difficult for a forecast to provide an indication of what the actual result will be. That is what is done. The corporate plan is a forward-looking document. The annual report provides the actual result.
surely it's consistent that a forward-looking document can look historically at how accurate previous forecasts have been, and that in the new document there's no mention of them at all.
I'm not sure I understand quite how that could happen. The reporting of, to the extent there is a need to report the actual numbers in a given year, that is done in the annual report.
It is indeed. It just seems very convenient for the government in terms of its policy backflip that it was able to sit on that information in terms of those further cost blowouts, which were from 29 billion up to 41 billion, and then from 49 billion to 51 billion.
Maybe, Senator, if I could provide a little bit more context around cash and how it's being used in NBN over time. During the build of NBN, starting in 2009, NBN needed to, first of all, have an equity injection. Later, it had a debt injection from government, and then subsequently it borrowed more debt from the private market. It will be borrowing more debt, but nowhere near as much more debt as it undertakes new investment cases. Mm-hmm. But the phase we're referring to has finished with the acquiring of all of the equity and debt that it needed to build an NBN that served all of Australian premises. And the new debt or the new cash that will be taken on reflects new investment cases which are outlined in the corporate plan. The degree of the increase in the debt and equity of NBN is nowhere near going to be as increased each year as it has been in the past.
So if cash flow loss is larger than NBN needs to borrow money, further money, that's correct, is it not?
NBN, well, Senator, it is...
It needs to draw down on cash.
Correct.
For the purposes of making future sensible and prudent investments.
If the cash flow loss is larger than expected, that means even more money. Is that not correct?
Senator, if there is a sensible, prudent business case for an investment which will make a return for the company, then it may indeed need to borrow more money than originally planned to make that investment, knowing that there is a return on it.
Indeed, we know that that's the case. But it does go back to the fundamentals of what we're borrowing the money for, be that copper or fibre, and the various debates that we've had over a long period of time in this place about what that costs and what it should cost. If debt goes up, then peak funding goes up. Is that not correct?
Senator, I'm not sure that those two terms are effectively one and the same. Peak funding was a concept that made sense, again, in the project phase where it was associated with the peak funding required for that project phase. I think there are a different set of metrics that would make more sense to pay attention to with respect to NBN now that it has completed the build.
Okay, so you confirm that if cash flow loss is larger, then NBN needs to borrow more money?
What I said, Senator, is if there is a case with a positive return to make investments in the network, then there may be a need to borrow money to fund those positive return investments.
Yes, but that's still more money, is it not? I understand that there is that there's you're using that debt to pay for capital, which is essential, but that essentially means that in order to pay for that future capital, if the cash flow loss is larger, that your need to make those investments in new capital is larger than your income, then you will need to borrow more money, correct?
It depends on the shape of your balance sheet. You've got to draw down cash from your balance sheet, but you may need to put more debt into your balance sheet. But it depends on how much money's in.
Yeah, and maybe if I can refer you to page 54 of the corporate plan for 2021. Now that NBN is built, revenue is going to start coming in at increasing rates. So revenue is forecast to go from 3.8 in financial year 2020 to increase to 6.2 billion in financial year 24, which will start to see positive EBITDA from next year. And that's what's forecast. And in fact, there was positive EBITDA in the half-year results announced most recently.
So if cash flow loss is larger than expected, NBN will need to borrow more money. As of the financial year 2020, cash flow losses go up and debt goes up. Is that not correct?
Senator, if it is the case that if the forecast in a year suggests, is for a certain amount of cash required for a certain range of activities, and then during that year a decision is made to undertake some additional activities, then more cash and possibly therefore taking on more debt will be needed to fund those additional activities.
Senator Pratt, you've had a good half
Yes,
hour run
we
of
do
this.
seem to be going around in
Senator
something
Pratt,
of a
you've
circle.
had a good
I'm happy to
half.
come back to this. Thank
Yep.
you.
Okay.